Hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's event from the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts at Newcastle University. I'm Rachel Hewitt and I'm a lecturer in creative writing at Newcastle, and I'm the director of NCLA. And tonight we are hugely honoured to have the journalist and writer Hadley Freeman with us, discussing her memoir, House of Glass. But before introducing Hadley, I'd just like to let you know what we've got coming up for the rest of this term. Next week, on Thursday, the 25th of November, NCLA is hosting the Poetry Book Society Autumn Showcase, in which the poets Raymond Antrobus and Hannah Lowe will be reading from their latest collections. Raymond's latest collection is All the Names Given. It's an investigation into language, miscommunication, place, and memory. And Hannah's latest collection is The Kids, an exploration of how social class, gender, and race intersect with education. On the 1st of December, the novelist Omar El-Akkad will be talking about his highly acclaimed recent novel, What Strange Paradise, described by the New York Times as an instant classic. And our final event of the semester features the novelist Sarah Moss, who will be reading from and discussing her most recent novel, The Fell, which was just published this week and described by Waterstones as a blazing novel of the state of the nation during the pandemic. So there's a lot coming up, and all of these events are taking place online and completely free of charge, and we'd absolutely love to see you there virtually. But you do need to register in advance, so please do so at www.ncl.ac.uk/NCLA/events. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind you that all of our past events are also still recorded and archived and accessible online to watch and listen to on our online archive. And you can find that archive, the easiest way is really just to Google NCLA archive. So now it's a delight to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Hadley Freeman, who'll be reading from and talking about her book, House of Glass, The Story and Secrets of a 20th-Century Jewish Family. Hadley began her career as a fashion journalist on the fashion desk of The Guardian newspaper and as a writer and columnist for UK Vogue. She's the author of 4 books, The Meaning of Sunglasses, Be Awesome, Modern Essays for Modern Ladies, and Life Moves Pretty Fast, The Lessons We Learned from 80s Movies. And her most recent book, House of Glass, was published last year. It was a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller and was Waterstones Book of the Month in March this year. So Hadley, welcome this evening, and it's a real pleasure to speak to you tonight about your extraordinary book. And I was just wondering if you can begin with a reading from the book to kind of situate us in the world and the voice of House of Glass.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me. And thank you for everyone who's watching. I'm incredibly flattered. I honestly never thought anyone but my dad would be interested in this book. So getting an invite like this is always is very exciting. I'm going to be a bit creaky, I'm afraid, probably, just because I haven't really even sort of, after the book came out, it feels so long ago now. I wrote it so long ago because these things just take such a long time to be published. So I'll probably be incredibly surprised by what I read. So I thought I would just start with the introduction to let those of you who haven't read it get an idea of what the book's about, and also to remind myself what on earth it's about. So this is how the book starts. I stood up to shut the closet door, and that's when I spotted the shoebox right at the back, behind a pile of leather handbags. It was burnished red, although it looked almost gray, covered in over a decade's worth of dust. Surely, I thought, it would just contain another pair of slightly battered kitten-heeled sandals. But still, I'd come all this way. I might as well look inside. So I sat back on the floor, pulled it out, and opened it. I did not find shoes. Instead, it was filled with the secrets my grandmother had managed to keep all her life and some years beyond. The road that led me to rifling through my grandmother's closet a dozen years after she died began for me 23 years earlier, in 1983, when I was 5 years old. That was the year my parents took me to Europe for the first time to meet my French family. My grandmother's oldest brother and his wife, Henri and Sonia Glass, another brother, Alex McGee, and their last surviving cousins, Alex and Manya Ornstein. My grandmother, Sala, also joined us there, flying over from her home in Florida, where she lived with her American husband, my grandfather, Bill. My dad was keen for us to meet them all, perhaps to balance out our family tree, where my mother's side was fruitful with its abundance of American aunts, uncles, and cousins scattered generously around the United States, from Washington, D.C. to Seattle. My father's side was comparatively barren. Until this trip, it had consisted in my mind solely of my grandparents and uncle, my father's younger brother, Rich, all clustered together in Miami. I knew my grandmother had had to leave her relatives behind in France when she escaped what was vaguely described to me as the war. And this, my father said, was why I didn't have much family on his side. He didn't explain where the family was on his very American father's side, and I was too young then to think to ask why. My mother's family was warm, rambunctious, and close, and I always looked forward to seeing my cousins, who I thought of as quasi-siblings. But when we visited my paternal grandparents, they snapped at one another continuously, which scared me because I never saw my parents fight. Also, for reasons I was in no way capable of articulating then, I found my grandmother difficult. If pressed, I would have said she was weird, but what I meant was that she seemed sad, and sad adults are confusing for children, especially ones as sheltered as I was. When we visited them in Miami, my grandfather, in his white trousers and golf shirts, would sit with us by the hotel pool on the candy-colored sun loungers, enjoying the sunshine, letting my sister and me twirl his enormous mustache. My grandmother would sit under an umbrella separate from us. She was further protected from the sun by a wide-brimmed hat and various Hermes-like silk scarves wound in complicated knots around her neck, mini Dior handbag in her lap. She looked as distinctly French as my grandfather looked American, with the naturally soft, elegant looks of a Renoir painting, now overlaid with the melancholy of a Hopper one. Often by the pool, she would read the French fashion magazines her brother sent her from Paris, and despite having lived in America for 40 years by the time I was born, she clung on tightly to her French accent. So it made sense to me that she would come with us to France. After all, she was emphatically French. I flew with my parents from New York to Paris, then took a train to Deauville, a seaside resort in Normandy. Deauville looked then and still looks now frozen in the mid-20th century, with its grand hotels and long beach dotted with large, colorful beach umbrellas, to which liveried waiters brought three-course meals on silver trays. We went there to meet the French relatives because that is where they like to go on holiday from their homes in Paris, albeit rarely with one another. Even though I was only 5 at the time, my memories of this holiday are clearer than of ones I took in my teens and 20s. Partly this was from the novelty of being outside America for the first time, and the experience was as jarringly formative as the first day of school. But it's also because my family takes so many photos, and more photos were taken of this holiday than of most people's weddings, mainly by the family photographers, my grandmother's oldest brother Henri, and my father. We are also a family of anecdotalists, and it is impossible for me to separate now what I actually remember about this trip and what I remember from the photos and stories told afterwards. Am I remembering actual memories, or are they memories of memories? In my family, the line between the two is not always clear, but everything I've written here about this trip has been corroborated by those wise enough to make this distinction better than me. In other words, my parents. On our first night in Deauville, we arranged to meet everyone at the front of the hotel dining room before dinner. I assumed that my French family would turn out to be like my American one, and I'd be running up and down the beach with my new cousins, the way I ran around Cincinnati with my cousins there. Because in my 5 years of experience, that's what extended families were like. But when we arrived in the dining room, a group of impossibly old people were waiting for us, none of whom looked predisposed to run anywhere. Only 2 of them could speak English, Alex McGee and Sonia. The rest just smiled and nodded at me, and I, gripping my mother's hand, shyly did the same back. Deauville, it turned out, was nothing like Cincinnati. So it was with some relief that I saw my grandmother arriving, the last of the group. At least I knew her and she spoke English. But instead of joining us, she hung back, watching her siblings and cousins. Just as I was about to go over to her, I noticed something I'd never seen before. She was crying, and then she turned around and rushed out of the room. "What's wrong with my grandmother?" I asked my mother, but she shook her head at me and held her finger up to her lips. I looked at my father for an answer, but he was looking towards where his mother had disappeared and went after her. Alex McGee, whose real surname was Glass, like Henri and Sonia, as well as my grandmother originally, and it didn't occur to me to ask why he'd apparently changed it, had a cabana on the beach, and my parents said I could use it to change in and out of my swimsuit. Having one's own cabana seemed to me the absolute pinnacle of cool, but that was before I learned that that was before I saw what Alex Ornstein had on the beach, his own giant umbrella, red with the blue flag on top. And every day we would all meet under it for lunch, attended to by smartly dressed waiters. Even though it was Alex Ornstein's umbrella, Alex McGee dominated those lunches. He was small, bald, and tough like a bullet, but he loved talking with my father, as well as with his cousin, Alex Ornstein, who he occasionally embraced fondly. He didn't give hugs to my sister or me, but he seemed to enjoy talking with us, telling us about the famous artists he knew, none of whom we'd ever heard of because we were respectively 3 and 5 years old. When I got lost on the beach one day, it was Alex McGee and his cabana I looked for, because I knew he'd know how to get me home. Like my grandmother, Sonia was short and had red hair, but where Sala was thin, quiet, and melancholic, Sonia was a solid ball of vibrating energy. With her bright hair, pink lipstick, and blue eyeshadow, she looked like a firecracker. She taught my sister and me how to play bridge and introduced us to pain au chocolat, which was even more exciting than bridge. In the morning, she would meet us in the hotel lobby and walk us onto the beach, where she seemed to know every person on the boardwalk. Sonia's husband, Henri, was at 6 feet, a foot taller than his wife and siblings, but gentler than them, and at 83, still strikingly handsome. He would catch my eye across the table and make apologetic smiles for not being able to speak English, and he would often hold my grandmother, stroking her hair like she was still his baby sister. When Sonia and Alex McGee argued viciously over lunch, Henri would just sit back, letting it blow over. We all knew you shouldn't get between a firecracker and a bullet. Alex and Manya Ornstein were the frailest and in many ways the easiest going members of the groups, often acting as peace brokers between Sonia and Alex McGee. Being an Ornstein seemed to be less complicated than being a Glass. Despite Deauville's differences from Cincinnati, I had a wonderful holiday. I was introduced to French cultural essentials such as triple scoop ice cream cones and baguettes. But the grown-ups occasionally seemed to be grumpy, especially Sonia and Alex McGee, who were barely able to sit at the same table by the end of the holiday. This was the first time in decades that they had all spent any time together. It was also to be the last. At the end of the week, I went back to the United States with my parents and sister, and soon after, slowly, inexorably, everyone I met in Deauville died. My grandmother died in 1994 when I was 16. She had made a life for herself in America, but she never stopped seeming sad to me, and her sadness never stopped unnerving me. As a result, I never let her get close to me. By the time she died, I was closed off in my own sadness, hospitalized for anorexia, which kept me from her funeral. For years afterwards, thinking about all this made me feel things I still couldn't articulate. So again, I probably would have said it made me feel weird. But what I really meant was that it made me feel terrible. So I deliberately didn't think about her or any of my French family at all. But when I became an adult, I suddenly couldn't stop thinking of them. Moments I had barely noticed at the time, yet which had made enough of an impact to leave a footprint in my memory, began to surface. My grandmother reaching out for Henri's hand in Deauville, Alex all alone in his grand apartment in Paris in the 1990s, surrounded by Picasso and Matisse paintings. Sonia and Alex not even speaking to one another at my bat mitzvah, despite living almost their whole lives as neighbors in Paris. I was ashamed if I had pushed my grandmother away and that I'd never asked any of them about their pasts when they were still alive. But then no one else did either. My father, my uncle Rich, and Henri and Sonia's daughter Danielle hardly ever talked to their parents about their lives before us. We all knew lightly penciled outlines of stories, but nothing concrete, and certainly nothing that seemed provable. I knew that my grandmother, along with her mother and brothers, lived in Paris in the 1930s. At some point, she met my American grandfather and went with him to the States. I knew that Alex had fought in the war and was then captured and sent to a concentration camp, but somehow escaped. I knew he had worked as a fashion designer and then an art dealer after the war. About Henri and Sonia's past, I knew nothing. It felt increasingly apt that the one time I had met them all was in Deauville, because Deauville is a picture-perfect image of an idealized French past. My grandmother, with her chic French fashion, her home full of French art and magazines, was herself an image of idealized Frenchness, and in her obvious homesickness embodied a longing for the France of her past. I knew there was a story, but even thinking about it felt like touching a bruise, and I started alternately tapping the sore spot and then running away in horror at what I was doing. Just an afternoon trip to an archive to look for their birth certificates, for example, would exhaust me so much emotionally, I'd have to take a 2-hour nap afterwards. I hid my early files and notebooks in the backs of various cupboards around my flat, kidding myself that I wasn't doing what I was, in fact, starting to do. When I was in my mid-20s, I came up with an idea of how to write about my grandmother in what seemed like a painless way. I would write about her relationship with fashion. By now, I was working as a journalist in London, and my grandmother had used her wardrobe to make a defiant statement about her identity. While other Jewish grandmothers in Miami wore shapeless shift dresses and badly fitted clothes and garish prints, my grandmother always looked like she was going to a fashion show. Her hair and makeup were always impeccable, her accessories exquisite. She wore distinctly French styles, Yves Saint Laurent-like peasant tops, Chanel-esque jackets, proudly emphasizing her non-Americanness through her clothes. At this point, my Uncle Rich was living in my grandparents' former apartment, and fortunately for me, he hadn't thrown away any of her old things. So I flew there simply intending to go through my grandmother's closet and describe her wardrobe, using it as a sort of meta way to write about her, because writing simply about her without any proxy still felt like staring straight into the sun. And so after arriving at what was now my uncle's apartment, I opened her closet door and began. After a while, I saw the shoebox at the back, and this is what I found inside. A small photo album filled with pictures of Henri and Alex looking younger than I'd ever seen them. There were several also of my grandmother as a child, and also later photos of her as a young man embracing someone whose face had been scraped out by someone's fingernail. A couple of photocopied pages from a book titled Dressmakers of France. Letters from someone called Kisling, all dated in the 1940s and sent from Los Angeles. Photos of a balding man in round spectacles that I'd never seen before, in which he looked like he was in a concentration camp. On several of the photos, my grandmother had written in her distinctive handwriting, Jacques. A pencil drawing of Jacques mounted on a cardboard on which the artist had written Comte de Pithiviers, 1941. A photocopied note on which someone had written in French that La Famille Glace was hiding in Paris under an assumed name. A telegram from the Red Cross apologizing for the distressing news contained within. More photos and news clippings of Alex McGee, photos of him with Pablo Picasso, and a scrappy piece of paper at the bottom folded into quarters on which someone had drawn a man, signed at the bottom, Avec Amitié Picasso. I put everything back in the shoebox in my bag, and flew home the next day. I knew I had a story now, and it wasn't about fashion. God, wonderful. That was really long. Oh, God, that takes forever.
So wonderful. Thank you so much. So your book begins, even before the section that you've just read, it begins with a quotation from Arthur Miller's Broken Glass about how sort of awareness of anti-Semitism is like some wire that goes half around the world, some truth that other people are blind to. And I was wondering if you could begin by telling us, kind of where this book principally began for you. Does it begin sort of in the present and the arguable resurgence of anti-Semitism, or is it in a sort of desire to step into your family's past?
Well, when I started it, which was vaguely around 2006, it was really just to tell the story of my family's past. But I just knew there were interesting stories, and I didn't know what they were, but I thought they would be worth telling. And I just spent the next, let's see, I really started kind of in about 2003 is when I started. And I spent the next 12, 13 years just researching. And I really had no confidence that I could turn it into a book. So it wasn't until the resurgence of anti-Semitism that I noticed specifically with the election of Donald Trump and the scandals in the Labour Party and Brexit, which I saw as just a very nationalistic tendency asserting itself, that I thought, actually, maybe there has some modern relevance and it's worth me writing this book now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the book kind of is chiefly focused on the lives of 4 Jewish siblings, your grandmother, Salah, and her brothers, Henri, Jacques, and Alex. And I was really interested in a review of the book that I think was in The Guardian, actually, about the particular connection between grandparents and grandchildren, and that sort of grandchildren are often the kind of conduit through which secrets come to light, sort of secrets that might be too weighty for children to encounter. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk a bit about the meaning that your grandmother has for you and sort of how it felt to research and write about her as opposed to, say, your father.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to write about my father. I'm just too close. I think it's the same thing. I think you need to have a little bit of distance. And I could also assess more clearly sort of the impact that my grandmother had on her children, because I can see my father and my uncle and how her life affected them. In the same way, I'm sure my children will one day see how my father affects me. I don't mean that in a bad way at all. It's very hard when you're that close. I don't know how people write books about their parents. My father helped enormously with this book. So it's not like he was turning a blind eye to anything, but I think he was just so close to both his parents and loved them both so much that the idea of writing about it and particularly addressing the unhappiness of their marriage would have just been too painful for him and would have felt like a betrayal. Whereas because I had that distance, that I was more able to do that. And also, but also for me, I did love my grandmother, even though I was incredibly bad at acknowledging that when she was alive, and was just kind of too young to understand her. I also feel like I understand her better now. It sounds incredibly narcissistic, but in terms of someone who had to move countries, I understand that. Someone who then was ill for a very long time as a young woman, I've had that. Someone who doesn't always feel like they've had control over their life. I mean, obviously my grandmother had a lot less control than me, but I can understand that, and I can understand her fury at feeling like she's living a life that she didn't want in a place she didn't choose. I mean, it's not like that's happened to me at all, but I can imagine that frustration very clearly.
Yeah, and so to give sort of members of the audience who haven't read the book sort of a bit of context, the book begins in a market town in Poland called Charnów. And with horrible symmetry, it's only about 20 kilometers from Auschwitz. And it's where the Glass siblings are born in the first years of the 20th century. And then in 1920, they leave Poland for Paris. And, would you be able to sort of fill in, members of the audience who haven't read it, sort of what motivates that move to Paris, and what Paris comes to represent for the siblings?
So they had to leave after World War I because there was this enormous resurgence of anti-Semitism in Poland after World War I, because Poland was so decimated from the war, and the Jews were blamed for no reason. So they were the pogroms, which is when the Polish Catholics would come to Jewish towns and kind of beat up the Jews and steal their businesses. And actually, Charnów was the first Polish town where a pogrom happened. So that happened. So they decided to go to Paris, which is where their cousins, the Ornsteins, were already living. And actually, I'm having dinner with one of the grandchildren of one of the Ornstein cousins tonight. So we are all still very close. So they followed the Ornsteins to Paris. And Jacques was the most traditional one. He became a Jewish tailor in the Marais, which is now very posh, but back then was the Jewish quarter. And Alex followed him. He was only 14. And he decided he wanted to be a couturier, which is much more unusual. And so he started training in the salons. Then the mother, Haya, and Sala turned up, and Sala suffered from pleurisy of the lungs, and she was put in a sanatorium. So she was mainly in this hospital quite far away from them in Paris. And then Henri turned up eventually, and he went into business sort of with Jacques, where they ran the tailors, where they worked in a tailor shop, and they ran this woodworking business, which immediately went bust. And then over the period of the 1920s and 1930s, Alex did become a couturier. He was making couture clothes. And Jacques was still working as a tailor. Henri was trying to find a good job. Henri met Sonia. He was starting to work as an engineer, which is what he trained in college. Sala eventually got out of the sanatorium. She was making clothes for a wholesaler, which is like making clothes for the high street. And she was engaged to a Jewish dentist. Then we get to the mid-30s. Alex McGee, as he was known then, he changed his name to Alex McGee to possibly sound a bit less Jewish, possibly to sort of separate himself from his family, was hanging out with a lot of artists, so people like Chagall and Kisling. And the French art world was one of the first industries to become really anti-Semitic after the Great Depression. France had become less anti-Semitic after the Dreyfus affair, which I'm sure everyone there has heard of. And that was becoming anti-Semitic again because France takes a real national pride in its art. And suddenly there was this attitude that they didn't want all these immigrant Jews like Chagall coming in and affecting the quality of French art, sort of taking away the Frenchness of it. So Alex saw what was happening. So he knew earlier than most what was coming to France. He saw that this country that had offered them salvation, asylum, was becoming really anti-Semitic. And Sonia and Henri also were quite aware because Sonia was from what is now the Ukraine, and she kept in touch with people back home, and she heard about what the Nazis were doing. So the Glass brothers knew what was going on, and it just happened by coincidence that Alex met my grandfather, who's this guy called Bill, who was over in France. And he took Bill over to meet Sala for dinner with a plan in mind. And Bill saw her and just fell in love with her at first sight and proposed, said, please come with me to America. She sent him away. She said, I'm already engaged. Alex said to her, you have to go. The Nazis are coming. If you don't go, you're killing us. Henri said that, yes, that's true. And Alex said to her, look, he's a millionaire. He's a fashion designer. He lives on Park Avenue. What more do you want? So eventually Sala agreed. She went. And when she arrived, she realized that Alex didn't know this guy at all. He'd literally just met him that day when she met him. He wasn't a millionaire. He didn't live on Park Avenue. He wasn't a fashion designer. He ran a gas station on Long Island. And that is the story of my grandparents.
Yeah, and Salah's story is, I mean, you start off by saying how, your father gives you all these photographs of Salah, and you say to him, no, I want the emotional life. That's what I want to kind of bring out. And actually what you uncover is, I think, what you describe as a specifically female tragedy. She gave up not just her true love, but her dreams and professional fulfillment in exchange for protection by marriage, but no one was going to give her any plaudits for it. And I was sort of wondering if that was a motivation for you in writing your grandmother's story, is, to publicly recognize this specifically female tragedy, this form of self-sacrifice, which, is often omitted from the sort of more traditional public histories.
It wasn't when I started, honestly. What I found interesting about my grandmother is that, I'm obviously American. I grew up in New York, and the story that we're always told as Jewish kids in America is that your relatives that came to America from Europe, they were the lucky ones. They're the ones who escaped, this dark, evil continent of Europe. And I knew Alex and Henri. They were alive when I was young, and I knew my grandmother, and I could see that Alex and Henri, who stayed in France, were very happy, and I could see that Salah had come to America, was very unhappy. So I kind of was interested in that, and it was only when I started researching, and after I found the shoebox, and I realized I couldn't just write a book about my grandmother; it had to be about all the siblings. That I realized I could find out everything about my great uncles, but I couldn't find out anything about Salah, because Henri, Henri I found out about through his business records. Alex McGee I found out because he was being spied on by the Nazis, and Vichy. And also he was in the Foreign Legion for a while, so he had a war record. So I could also find that stuff out. And then there was this other brother, Jacques, who was also very easy to find out about because he also had a war record, and he was also being very closely watched by the Nazis. Whereas Salah, there's nothing. There's literally nothing. There's no file anywhere, because she wasn't interesting to anyone. She was just a woman. And that's when I sort of began to think more about this. I mean, obviously, people are talking about this now, how, no statues are of women and all that kind of stuff. And obviously that's true. But it's more just all these stories, just disappear. And it's not like these women were sitting at home having a great time. A lot of the time they were completely miserable. And they were trying to do their best to help the war effort, their families, their children, but no one gives a damn. That's just the least was expected of them.
Yeah, was her story the sort of hardest to kind of bring out into the light for the reason of that sort of lack of archival evidence?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing. And she didn't leave any notes. She didn't leave any records. It's not like she had any diaries. The only reason that shoebox was in the back of her closet is because she had this massive stroke when she was in her 80s. So she became incapacitated. If she'd known she'd about to die, I'm sure she would have destroyed that too. She wanted to keep her secrets, which then leads to a whole moral argument about why did I write this book about her, which is a different issue. So yeah, it was really hard, and I put it off because I couldn't just rely on the crutch of archival records. And Alex was the best at research, because as well as all the records, he left behind an unpublished memoir because he did want people to know his story. So he was great. And also he knew lots of famous people, and I could talk to them about him. So that was fine. Whereas my grandmother didn't know really anybody. So for her, I had to talk to my dad, my uncle, Henri's daughter, Danielle, those memories. There's my memories. Unfortunately, she still had a few friends who were alive when I started writing this book. They're not now, sadly. It took me so sodding long to write it. So it was just doing that. That's what it's like to research an ordinary person. You just have to kind of get your shoe leather out, essentially.
Yeah. And I mean, exactly what you just said, sort of Alex comes across as kind of, the opposite, a kind of biographer's dream, absolutely larger than life, present in these the sort of front row of kind of cultural history in the sort of mid 20th century. But he sort of struck me that he must have presented his own kind of challenges to write about emotionally, to sort of draw out that emotional life.
Well, it's hard to know, the truth of what was going beneath, I guess. And I didn't think I would really be able to turn this into a book until my uncle Rich miraculously found this unpublished memoir, which had just been lurking around what was my grandmother's and is now my uncle's apartment, because then I could have Alex's real voice. But, like you say, it is hard knowing the truth beneath the bluster, but I was able to fact check a lot of the bluster. It is hard trying to ascertain some of his motivations. And of course, there's a lot of mystery around him that the people who knew him who are still alive acknowledge. And I put it in the book. There's a lot of mystery about his sexuality, for example. So yeah, there were challenges. The main challenge for me, I thought, was I didn't want him to dominate the book. I really was worried that people wouldn't notice my grandmother because she was the reason I started writing it. And actually what I found is that the one who really gets sort of put in the shadows a bit for readers, I think, is Henri, which I think is a shame because his story is amazing. But I also understand why that is. You have my grandmother, who's the woman. You have Alex, who's so out there. You have Jacques, who's the tragic story. So where does Henri fit in? Well, actually, if it wasn't for Alex, Henri would look like the heroic figure. But he's the quiet, gentle one. So he does get pushed a little bit to the shadows, I think.
And so, I mean, do you feel that you have a sort of kinship with Alex as well? You know, I know that you've spoken about the sort of kinship with your grandmother, but there's obviously this really close link in terms of your relationship to the world of fashion. And I was sort of, you know, wondering, if you can talk a little bit about what you describe as the way that the past holds on to you in ways that go beyond science, you know, how that sort of love of fashion gets transmitted. But I suppose also, I mean, this is actually takes me to a kind of reader's question who probably phrases it much more pithily than me, which is just says kind of, why does fashion matter? You know, why in this book, fashion matters a lot, actually. It's very serious. You know, it is a kind of part of a process of sort of self-fashioning and beauty. Yeah. And yeah, could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, yes. So one of those strange things I found is how much fashion is in my family, which I'd never really ever thought about before. So Alex, as I said, became this couturier and was pretty successful before he then changed over into art. And then for reasons I never really thought about, I became a fashion journalist after university, which was quite random because I wasn't like in any way some sort of fashion obsessive, although I like to read Vogue. And then I found out as I was researching that Henri and Sonia's grandson, Alex de Betac, is this huge fashion show producer who I'm still very close to and works very closely with the fashion world. And then my Ornstein cousin, who I'm having dinner with tonight, used to be the PR for Mulberry and is still kind of peripherally involved in fashion. So obviously there is something about fashion that drew us all in. My connection with Alex is mainly that I knew him the best. I was 21 when he died. So he was alive the longest. And I was aware of his connection with fashion when I was alive. I don't know if I really consciously thought about it, but there was something about the conflation of Paris and fashion always in my mind for me, probably because he lived there. Why did it matter to them? And my grandmother loved fashion too, I should say. Well, for them, you know, they came from this really very, very poor Jewish shtetl in Poland and lived through the utter grimness of World War I there, and then the complete kind of bleakness and despair of World War II. And certainly for Alex and Henri and my grandmother, when they arrived in Paris, fashion was the way they got rid of the Polish side of themselves and became French. They all dressed in this very exaggeratedly French way. And actually, so did Jacques, the second brother. He dressed very finely too, considering he was just this very poor Jewish immigrant. They liked I think it was the way that they could have control over their identities and in some tiny way their lives. And for Alex, he writes in his memoir so much about how he'd always just seen ugliness growing up and now he wanted to see beauty. And I think that is very true for all of them. This was a way they could see beauty. And we see that too in America around the same time in the 1920s. So many of the people who set up the studios in Hollywood were Jews, and they were making these very beautiful, grand, silent, and then talking movies set in places where Jews actually weren't allowed in 1920s America, whether it was country clubs or golf clubs or, Beverly Hills. And I think it's a way to pretend that you are accepted and to create this world this beautiful world where you're accepted.
Yeah, and it was sort of on the train journey over, it was sort of, this isn't a very well formulated question, but it was sort of striking me that actually there's a really strong thread about sort of art and sort of the visual and visual beauty and kind of collecting in your book as well. Yeah. And I was sort of wondering, whether that's, that must be part of that desire to kind of surround oneself with beauty, but also there must be a kind of political action, for you in kind of creating a book that's, it's such a visual book. The photographs that you reproduce are just wonderful. And, it reminded me of a sort of an essay on life writing by an author whose name has now completely gone out of my head, but that compared sort of life writing to an act of collecting, that you sort of, collect these sort of remnants of someone's life and knit them together into a sort of exhibition in a way. And I was sort of wondering if there's, if that's a kind of political act for you in terms of a sort of form of, I guess, sort of cultural restitution, sort of after the dismantling of sort of Jewish art collections in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a part of that. And also just, I just felt like these people's lives should be remembered, and particularly, I mean, all of them. I'm not like trying to single anyone out, but Alex was such this huge figure in Paris. And when you go to the Pompidou and the Musée d'Orsay now, you'll see his name kind of on lots of the different paintings, donated by the family of Alex McGee and stuff, because with taxes in Paris, it's often easier just to give away paintings. But no one knows who he is. And I just think that's sort of sad. And no one really knows about this whole thing of École de Paris, which was the Paris School of Artists before the war, which meant the Jewish artists, and versus the École de France, which is the more traditional artists. And also, I mean, in terms of a political act, I just found that so many people were diminishing and continue to diminish the impact of anti-Semitism and, oh, Jews are all rich, so they're fine. That attitude. Well, first of all, not even the rich Jews were fine, in the 1930s. And, what happened back then is still just about within living memory. Like, it just amazes me how people really don't care, and people don't care if, just as an example, there's an awful Jewish stereotype on the cover of a book or something like that. People really just don't care.
Yeah. And it sort of strikes me that like your grandmother is actually a collector as well, right? The book actually begins from her collection as well. So I was sort of wonder if there's a sort of attempt to kind of reset the balance, to kind of give her a sort of prominence that her brother had.
Well, that was definitely true. And I wanted her to, I think her story is heroic as well. And she wasn't just this kind of quiet housewife in Long Island, which is how she ended up. There was something very heroic about and brave what she did. I mean, it was very heroic and brave what she did. And I found her story incredibly poignant and moving, and just felt it needed to be told. And it's not one of those stories that we hear from the Holocaust. It's not a glorious escape, and it's not a tragic death in 1942. It's something different, but I think it's also something that's very common. And since the book came out, I've gotten a lot of letters from people who say it's helped them, understand their own grandmother and mother, not because I think my writing's so brilliant, but because I think that story is actually a lot more frequent than it's told.
Yeah. But you also say that you question the morality of what you're doing. Could you talk a little bit about, because I mean, I'm sure lots of people in the audience are sort of we teach life writing at Newcastle, and there may be sort of life writing students who are often kind of, wrestling with these kind of questions about the sort of ethics, I suppose, of, writing one's own life, but more so, I think, writing the life of one's family members.
Yeah, I mean, the main ethical question is, would they have wanted me to do it? Because it's not like I asked any of their permission. So in the end, I had to rely on their children's permission, and their children were all incredibly helpful and supportive. How would any of them feel about it? Well, I think Alex would be pretty thrilled, although less than thrilled by my suggestion he might have had certain boyfriends at some point in his life. But I think he'd be pretty thrilled to see himself on, a bestseller list. I think Henri and Sonia and Jack would be completely bemused by it and just baffled by what on earth this was all about. And my grandmother, I really have no idea what she would think. She was such a self-effacing private person. But I hope that she would see it as coming from a place of love. But I also think she'd probably be glad not to be alive when it came out.
Yeah, I love the way that you kind of lay bare the research processes that went into it. And, that we see the kind of present day narrative of you actually making these discoveries, and, that changes the narrative and changes your interpretation of it. And I was sort of wondering, you must have had to make quite a lot of both creative and sort of editorial decisions about how to balance that sort of present day narrative with the lives that you're describing, and, sort of how to sort of shape the information that you discover at any one time. Could you sort of talk us through some of those decisions?
Well, I really didn't want myself to be in it that much. When I started, my editor was like, "Oh, you should put yourself in it. It's about your journey." And I just thought, oh, it isn't. Like, my journey is so much less interesting than these people's lives. But I also thought from the beginning, okay, I'm going to be honest with the reader from the start about what I know and what I don't, which is why I put all that in. Like, this is what I know at the beginning. And then when there were big discoveries, like, I'm not going to spoil or anything here, but Alex had always told us he escaped from the train on the way to Auschwitz. And none of us ever believed this. And I thought it would be, and I say, he told us this and none of us believed it. And I thought, well, it'd probably be more, maybe it would have more impact to see the shock of me finding the truth of that. So things when it's a big thing and when I find out what he actually did during the war, I thought, okay, fine, let's refract this through me, although I hate doing that, or let the reader find this out alongside with me or something. But I'm not going to say, I wouldn't, I couldn't have, I spent 3 days in the Polish archive and I found their birth certificates and this is what's on their birth certificates, because that is just freaking boring to read. Try to make it as much of a story as possible. But for the dramatic discovery moments, sure, I can pull out a bit and say, this is how I did it. This is where I was, the whole thing of how we found out whether he jumped off the train or not, I just found really fun. So that I just had to put that in there, really.
Yeah, and there's a number of those sort of wonderful moments where, you sort of hear an anecdote about Alex and you assume it must be sort of groundless bluster.
Yeah.
He can't actually have donated that incredibly famous painting to that museum, and they all turn out to be true.
Yeah. So, I mean, with him, a lot of it, so much of it was trying to find out what's true and not. And I just thought, well, it makes, I don't know if I consciously thought about it. I just thought it probably makes most sense if they're with me. But because I just didn't want to be, not being honest with the reader. I just thought, this is what I know. And so now I've got to find it out, because that makes it more interesting than this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I thought it'd be fun. This is what happened and this is what I found out. Whereas with someone like Henri, there wasn't that much mystery. Like, I had all his business records, so I just tried to tell it as much as possible as a story. And the only times I pull out are when I say, what's interesting about the business records is that it shows that he always felt he was going to be called to account for his presence in France again for the rest of his life. So he kept these daily records of what he did in his business. So that was kind of the most illustrative. With Jacques, I mean, I sometimes don't know if I did that right or not, because it is a bit of the research and a bit of his story. And maybe I should have just done it as his story. But it was interesting finding that stuff out, going to the concentration camp museums and, seeing the menus of, how you can see all this stuff is so mad, what they were all eating every day. And I thought, well, if I find that interesting, maybe, I mean, I don't think I'm such a unique person. The way I approached the whole book was thinking, I'm not that special. I think what I find interesting, lots of people find interesting, and what I don't find interesting, other people don't find interesting. Sorry, that's my silly phone. I don't mean that I'm a total narcissist and think I have this, everybody thinks like me. What I mean is I'm quite basic. So, and I'm not a historian, so I'm quite good with, so in terms of I'm kind of like a typical average reader in that sense. So I thought what I find interesting, maybe others will too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good instinct. But I think sort of one of those sort of sections where you're describing your research processes that I found kind of particularly sort of impressive and restrained really was describing your sort of emotional reconciliation with the sort of toll that it was taking on you of, really sort of, of what it takes out of you emotionally as a researcher to be encountering stories of your family dying at Auschwitz. And and you sort of describe this process of initially being incredibly emotionally sensitive and vulnerable to it, and then sort of making yourself kind of more hard-hearted and thinking you've got that down pat, and then sort of being devastated again.
Well, funnily enough, as you say that, the text you just heard was from my friend Daniel, who was helping me with the research, who's the one who told me I had to get hearted about it. So as you see, all the people in this book are still very much in my life. Yeah, and I don't know. I kind of think there's so many books about the Holocaust now. I'm amazed that so many people have the stomach to do this research, because it is bloody depressing. And I couldn't have done a whole book about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is actually a really tiny bit of the book. It's really just Jacques' chapter and a bit of Alex's chapter, like a bit of one of Jacques' chapter and a bit of one of Alex's chapters. And again, I just kind of saw myself as the basic reader what this is like to read all these records of all these babies who were killed, these mothers, these grandmothers. It is so depressing. And what I hadn't realized is that there are all these archives around that are just about that. So anything that I thought I'd put this on a postcard to a friend back home, I thought I'm going to stick in the book.
Yeah, I mean, do you have you must have felt kind of trepidation about about researching that kind of aspect of this book. And I mean, do you sort of feel anything similar about your next, or the book that you must be working on at the moment?
No. So I'm working on a book now about anorexia, which, as I mentioned in that introduction, is something I suffered from as a teenager and beyond. So no, that's not been like this. For a start, it's me, so it makes it a lot easier to research. And yeah, obviously there are sad elements to it, and there have been very sad things. I've interviewed for, girls and women I was in hospital with, and going back to the parents of those who I knew who died has been very hard and very painful. I'm not comparing those experience like between that and this. It is though different from researching the Holocaust, which is difficult because it's so hard to get your mind around it. Whereas anorexia is something I can get my mind around very easily. Let's see how I've been out of hospital for, I can't even work it out right now, 25 years, I think. And it's something I've thought about a lot. So it's something I really understand and can write about pretty easily.
Yeah. And there's clearly a sort of negotiation that's going on throughout House of Glass about sort of negotiating between the public and the private, I suppose. And, you kind of, I was quite struck actually by the sort of moment where kind of Alex as an art collector, has his own sort of collection of art that he won't sell actually, that is private. And it sort of seems to me that actually you're doing something kind of quite similar with sort of the information in the book. There are moments where we're told you're not going to hear about this,
Yeah. There's really only one, I think,
yeah,
because it's about Alex's daughter, who I think I call Charlotte in the book, which is not her real name. It's not that I'm trying to be coy. I really don't know. He has a daughter. None of us really knew who her mother was. And at her funeral, she said goodbye to us and cut us out of her life for reasons no one knows. And I'm not lying. Like, it's not like we were trying to steal her inheritance or something crazy like that. She just decided she didn't want to be with the family anymore. And she does know about this book. I was in contact with her when I was writing it. And I couldn't write about Alex without saying he has a daughter, but I also had to say she's not in this book because she doesn't want to be. And I can't really tell you any more than that because she's made it clear she wants to keep her privacy. But to be honest, there's not much more I can tell because I honestly don't know anything. So that's that. Yes, but it's true. Alex did have his own private collection, but he would show it to people. He just wouldn't sell it. So he would invite Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor around to look at his Van Goghs and stuff like that. Or Van Gogh. I never even know how you pronounce it. I should probably figure that out someday. Van Goghs or Van Goghs, just to make them jealous. But he wouldn't sell it. It's true.
And you must be negotiating sort of that kind of public-private boundary in your current book project. I mean, is it harder, easier, like with your own life?
Well, I have more choice, I guess, than Alex and Henri and everyone did. Yes, I don't know. I just don't really. It's not like I'm one of those let it all hang out people. Like, I'm really not. There's a few things that I don't get into, like, I don't even know what would I not get into in the book, stuff, but like family therapy sessions or something. But the truth is I don't really remember those. I'm relying a lot on my diaries that I kept during those years, but I'm pretty open about it, and there'll be things in the book that people don't like. I don't mean stuff about me, but some of my ideas about teenage unhappiness, which is an issue that has become strangely politicized by some ideological groups, I think. And I think teenage anorexia is really a part of a lot of that. Certainly in terms of gender dysphoria, I think anorexia is a dysphoria. And I know people aren't going to like that, but there's a lot of research in it. I've talked to a lot of doctors. I've talked to a lot of practitioners in eating disorders and adolescent mental health. I'm really focusing in the book on teenage girls. I'm not talking about male anorexia. I think it's a very different thing. And I'm not talking about adults so much. I'm talking about my experience and extrapolating other themes from it. And to be honest, I'm trying to do with it what I did with House of Glass, which is tell a story and pull themes out from it. So that's how I'm doing it. So, it's not an exhaustive look at anorexia. It's my story and what things can be learned from it, whether it's about, mothers, fashion, inheritability of mental illness, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. We're sort of running out of time, but I really want to ask you about the sort of structuring of House of Glass. And you've got this sort of kind of wonderfully sort of satisfying symmetrical structure where you sort of, start and end with two chapters where the siblings are kind of considered as a kind of unit, as a sort of unified whole. And then you sort of follow these sort of individual life narratives in the other chapters. And I was sort of wondering, was the book always thus, or did you sort of experiment with other ways of structuring it? Because it must have been really hard to balance the different sort of temporal narratives.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't experiment at all. I didn't start writing it until I'd figured it out. And it took a long time. I sort of thought every chapter was going to be all of them. And I was somehow going to have to explain what all of them were doing all the time. And just thinking about that gave me such a headache. And then my friend Jonathan Friedland, who works at The Guardian, I'm sure some people out there read him, recommended his friend to me, Jonah Cummings, who's this academic who lives in Israel, who he called the Jew Whisperer because he helps Jews with their memoirs. And Jonah happened to be in London one weekend and he came around to mine and I said, ugh, here's this story. And I just was like, bleh, here's what happens to everybody. And he said, so it's these four siblings, and one of them stays hidden in Paris. One of them is captured. One of them joins the resistance, and one of them emigrates to America. And I said, yes. And he said, well, those are the four paths that were open to Jews at that time. And I thought, right. And that kind of clarified it for me. I was like, oh, okay, so it's one chapter per each of them. But what I don't want to be doing is doing, Henri did this 1920 to 30, then Jacques did this 1920 to 30, because that's just whiplash for the reader. So I thought, okay, I'll divide up the century, because Henri was born 1901, Alex 1999. I'll divide up the century through the four siblings. So whose story needs to be told in which years? So I knew Jacques needed to be 1942. I knew Alex was 1943 to 45. So, who's having big things in certain years. So I divided up that and I just did it that way. Well, I'm glad you think it makes sense, because to me, it just seems this completely mad way of just dividing it. But I needed them to move the story forward. And it was just really luck that it was in the right chronological order of the siblings. So it was always going Henri, Jacques, Alex, Sala, Henri, Jacques, Alex, Sala, to move it always, because I really didn't want people to think it was just a World War II book. I wanted it to be the whole century.
Yeah, and it works brilliantly. To be honest, I'm going to listen back to this recording and take notes from what you just said, because group biography is just so hard to structure, exactly for what you just said, that not wanting to be like, right, here's one person in a decade and then we're going to go right back to the beginning of the decade and keep doing this over and over and over again. So I think the way that you've done it is kind of exemplar, really. I'm going to give it to students to read as a way of, this is something that really works for group biography.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I definitely am not the first person to, I don't know in terms of the years, but I grew up loving those kind of biographies of those aristocratic families, whether it's the Mitfords or the Astors and all those kinds of people. And they often do that, telling one sibling at a time. Obviously, the Mitfords are great for that. So that when you finish a chapter, you want to know more, but oh, right, you're now on to Decca, and now you're on to Debo, and now you're on to Diana. So it keeps the story moving that way. And the same with the Forsyte saga. You're told one member of a family after another. So I was really thinking that rather than any Jewish memoir, that kind of structure that keeps people reading and keeps reminding people of how interesting one particular sibling is.
But it also has this sort of really important effect, I think, which is to make the book incredibly multivocal. It's incredibly, there's we hear a lot of voices, and that's kind of wonderful. But I also think, it has this really important role in sort of challenging ideas about sort of homogenization. You sort of talk about, I think, how in terms of sort of, you don't like the phrase the Jewish ghetto, and that actually there's lots of different kind of regions and lots of different sort of geographical zones. And it sort of seems to me that you take a similarly sort of complex and nuanced attitude towards exploring different people's motivations. I was really struck. I mean, I think, one of the sort of key moments, the most sort of devastating moments in the book really is where Jacques is allowed out of the prison camp for a couple of days to meet his newborn baby, and then makes the decision to go back. And you're really cautious about, refusing to say this was the fault of his wife who told him to go back. And actually you explore the sort of multiplicity of, of different, all the sort of different dynamics that kind of sent him in that direction.
Well, I just think it's very simplistic when people talk about the Jewish this, or, who's right, who's wrong. There are lots of different things going on in a person's life. A person can make a choice for all sorts of different reasons. And same with assimilation. I mean, it can be good, it can be bad. Like, I just feel different people's circumstances, lead to different outcomes. I really just hate that black and white thinking. If you think differently from me, then you're a bad person. Well, human life isn't like that. I think it's very immature way of approaching it. And these were not just, statistics. These were humans, with very different personalities. So of course the choices they would make would probably be different. And those who did make the same choices did so for very different reasons and had very different lives. So it helps, of course, that I knew them. So that's easier to bring the humanity towards them. But I would hope that most people over the age of 18 will understand that people are complicated. People are rarely good or bad. And what people in the 1930s did not know what we know now. So who are we to judge, really? I'm not saying
this is not a kind of seamless transition to the last question, which was what I was trying to do anyway. So we've got an audience question, which I was sort of trying to kind of work towards and haven't managed seamlessly, but anyway. And it's really kind of returning us sort of back to the beginning, I think, really, which is sort of the relationship of the book and the book's gestation to contemporary anti-Semitism. And the question is really about, if you yourself identify as progressive or left-leaning, does anti-Semitism that comes from the left kind of hurt more, I suppose?
Well, it's just more surprising, really, which is very naive of me. But it was just really surprising, the whole Corbyn era. And I don't know if it radicalized me, but it just really shocked me that people I know, people I work with, would kind of jazz hands it away. I really thought the whole point of the labor movement and progressives and the left or whatever was to fight for minorities, fight for vulnerable minorities. I hadn't realized that so much of that kind of sort of SJP, that kind of far left mentality, is that Jews are capitalists and Israel is just flat out an oppressor. Ignore what the current government or the government of the past 20 years has been doing. Just the concept of Israel is oppressive and colonialist. I just really underestimated that. So yeah, it obviously anti-Semitism and fascism on the right. All fascism is on the right, maybe, but anti-Semitism certainly on the right is, in some ways, in many ways more dangerous. It can be more destructive. And we've seen in France, people, old women being murdered in their apartments. But on the left, it's very painful, and it's very enraging, I would say.
Yeah. So on that happy note, it's 7:30, so we better sort of wind up. But I just want to say, a huge thank you for your generosity this evening, but for writing this book, which I think is an extraordinary work of of group biography, of family memoir, but also, I mean, as you say, just really important in tackling anti-Semitism and that sort of bringing to life of individual human lives, of making it human and personal. It's so important. So thank you so much, Hadley. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you this evening.
Oh, thank you. And I'm so sorry I read for so long. I really should have timed that better.
That was absolutely wonderful. I loved hearing it. All right, so thank you, and thank you to everyone for tuning in this evening, and we'll be around next week as well, so it'd be lovely to see you next week. All right, thank you. Good night.